Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Jess Epston. I am the lead for the Band and C program at the Institute for Emerging Issues. I will be your MC today. And please go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat, your organization, maybe where you're Zooming from, and we'll get started in a couple of minutes. And just wanted to give a shout out. Thank you to all the amazing II staff helping today. So yeah, go ahead and introduce yourselves in the chat, where you're zooming in from. I know we had some folks from all over the country joining today, so that's exciting. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and get started. I'm also excited to see where everyone's zooming in. We got people from the East, the West, all over. This is great. So we are just so honored to have so many amazing speakers joining from across the state and country to give various perspectives on the intersections between digital equity and disaster. So this is a vast, very serious and grief-filled topic, one that varies across geographies, populations, and sectors. And it is also changing frequently as climate impacts change, as technology develops. This is a really, very moving target. So we hope that this webinar can be a generative space to add to the continuing conversation on digital equity and disaster preparedness and recovery in North Carolina and throughout the digital inclusion field. And depending on what's discussed today by our panelists and attendees, this might be the first of multiple gatherings on this topic. So can move to the next slide. Yeah, so today's agenda, we are going to just sort of go over a little bit about who we are at IEI and Band and C. Then we'll get to hear from our amazing partners at the North Carolina Department of Information Technology and give a little bit of an update there. And then we get to hear from all our amazing panelists on some strategies and experiences that they've had around this topic. And then we'll have some time for some Q&A. So I'm first going to pass it over to Samantha Graham, the Director of Community Initiatives at IEI, to introduce.
Thank you, Jess. Hi, all. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon and morning for those on the West Coast or Hawaii. Just some kind of background on who we are at the Institute for Emerging Issues. We connect North Carolinians across sectors, regions, and perspectives for collaborative work on key emerging issues affecting our state's future economic competitiveness. You may know us for our Emerging Issues Forum, a convening of thought leaders held every year since 1986. Next slide. With 14 million people expected to call North Carolina home by 2050, our next series of Emerging Issues Forums will focus on an issue of critical importance to our economic well-being, ensuring we have highly coordinated, future-forward infrastructure planning to meet this demand. Over the next 3 years, IEI will focus on 3 key interrelated issues: energy, water, and housing, while also folding in other key infrastructure challenges and opportunities involving transportation and broadband. According to Duke Energy, electricity demand in North Carolina is growing at the fastest rate seen in 30 years. Expected growth by 2030 is now 8 times higher than the expectation set in 2022's North Carolina Carbon Plan. On top of that, North Carolina's current electric grid is aging. Meeting the needs of our growing population and evolving economy will require capacity expansion and diverse resources of electricity. For the past year, IEI has worked with state and local partners to examine the changes driving the electric grid of the future. Please join us at our Emerging Issues Forum in Raleigh on February 19th, 2025. More information is in the chat to register. And now I'll turn it back to Jess to give some context to our digital inclusion work.
Thank you, Samantha. So just a really quick overview about Band and C. Many of you all are partners, but many of you all might be new to this work. So our goal at Band and C is to provide technical assistance and planning capacity for local level digital inclusion planning across the state. And we're so excited that as of this summer, all counties are now in the planning process or have completed a county or regional level digital inclusion plan. So we're very excited about that. But also in the context of today's topic, we know that these plans can completely change with events like Helene. So some of those projects that were underway in Western North Carolina were physically wiped out. And our planners, led by our partners at the councils of regional governments, Dogwood Health Trust, have had really a lot of things change. So again, we're just really grateful for some of them to be here today, and keeping them all in our thoughts around digital inclusion leaders, but also just as North Carolinians who have gone through this really difficult time. So we at Band and Sea are continuing to support our partners in the West and sort of figuring out, okay, what does this look like now? Um, but we've also been focusing on Central and Eastern North Carolina through kickoff events and planning resources. And we're just really grateful for all our partners across the state. So as always, we have to share resources. These slides will be shared, but these are just some key resources. We also really want to uplift the North Carolina Inclusive Disaster Recovery Network as a key group that has been for years helping North Carolina when it comes to emergency preparedness and response. So we're going to put some things in the chat. Feel free to sign up for our connected newsletter to get monthly digital inclusion updates from us and our resource hub that supports local level digital inclusion planning. And now I get to pass it over. So we're so grateful to have leadership from North Carolina's statewide Office of Digital Inclusion. And we will get a brief update on how NCDIT has been responding to Helene from Nate Denny. So Nate is the Deputy Secretary for Broadband and Digital Equity with the North Carolina Department of Information Technology Division of Broadband and Digital Equity. So take it away, Nate.
Thank you so much, Jess. Really appreciate your time and appreciate the work that's happened at the Institute over the last few years and the partnership that we've had supporting the building of digital equity across North Carolina. I'll keep it pretty brief today, but I think the big theme that I want to start with before turning our attention to Hurricane Helene and its impacts on our little bucket of issues is that leadership matters. And 3 years ago, Governor Roy Cooper set out a vision for building a state of digital equity that would focus really a historic level of resources on not just incentivizing the deployment of high-speed internet infrastructure across the state, but also making sure that every North Carolinian had access to a device, could afford the service, and had the opportunity to build the types of digital skills really needed to compete in the modern economy. And in doing that, he stood up the nation's first Office of Digital Equity and Literacy, which brings me back to kind of theme one about leadership mattering. The reason that North Carolina, in my view, is in such a strong position to build digital equity and really meet this moment and this mission is threefold. One, it is the level of funding, right? The incredible once in a lifetime funding opportunity we've got. Two, the strong partnerships we've got with everybody else working, kind of steering in the same direction. And three, the leadership at the Department of Information Technology, specifically in the Office of Digital Equity and Literacy, making sure that that we are amplifying and supporting and standing up your work, all the work of all the people here. And Annette Taylor and Maggie Woods have done just an incredible amount of work and shown such leadership here, helping North Carolina meet this moment. You know, with $1 billion in American Rescue Plan funds and $1.5 billion more through the bipartisan infrastructure law, and I'll talk about all the money, and I swear I will get off slide one in a minute. There's just so much attention directed to what type of technology are we using? Are we doing fiber? How much Starlink do we need to do coming out of the Helene experience? All these infrastructure questions. But if we subsidize $2.5 billion freaking dollars worth of technology deployment and no one can afford it and no one knows how to use it, we'll have missed the moment. We will have left a lot of North Carolinians behind. And so I just wanted to take this opportunity with this particular audience, this group of stakeholders, to thank Annette and Maggie for their leadership here, because this mission wouldn't be the same without their efforts. I also want to highlight them because unfortunately I have to drop in like 8 minutes. So they're going to stick around for the Q&A session. So there's also selfish reasons here. They're awesome. Thank them. Also, they can answer any tough questions that y'all have. So with that, if I can jump to the next slide, please. I don't think I'm controlling the slides, correct? There. All right, so we'll spend 5 seconds on this one and then we'll jump into the substance, right? Like I said, we've got more than 1 million North Carolinians that are on the wrong side of the digital divide, right? And that could be because they have one of four or more of four distinct problems: access to the high-speed internet infrastructure, the ability to afford the service, the device, the tablet or laptop that's usable at home to actually participate in the modern economy, and then the skills, right? Can they update a LinkedIn account? Can they use an online calendar? Can they access basic government services, right? Or telemedicine, right? The skills piece is incredibly important, but Governor Cooper set out a vision to address all of those areas, not just the internet, the infrastructure deployment. Next slide, please. And recognize that North Carolina, coming out of COVID, had just a tremendous opportunity. North Carolina received about $5.5 billion worth of American Rescue Plan state and local fiscal recovery funds. And Governor Cooper said, we're going to send more than $1 billion of that to the problem of the digital divide. We put together a plan. We sold it at the General Assembly against all odds, and got just this bipartisan shared commitment to using this one-time resource opportunity to really attack all the roots of the problem. That's almost $1 billion in infrastructure deployment through several programs that you may or may not have heard of. The GREAT Grant program is the one that's been around the longest. That Jeff Searle, who I believe is on the call, was instrumental in setting up in North Carolina with the help of Amy Huffman when she used to work for the department as well. We a lot of great alums still in this community. We're really grateful for that. But we've also launched now the Completing Access to Broadband program, which is $400 million intended to directly empower county governments and bring them to the table negotiating with internet providers. We've awarded about $120 million from that fund so far and are about to do a lot more. We've got, as of Annette, Maggie, I don't know if y'all know if it's official yet, but if it's not, I might be breaking news here. But today we're announcing 38 new county scopes of work, which will bring us to 91 of our 100 counties that have ongoing completing access to broadband procurements for the deployment of high-speed internet service. So all told, we have now pushed out almost $600 million worth of state and federal funding, including $44 million from Annette and Maggie's office, the Office of Digital Equity and Literacy. And that's grant funding that has helped fund digital navigator roles across the state, help invest in community college and library training programs, county governments and COGS, any number of entities even represented here in this conversation that are helping support local capacity and creating education opportunities for residents across North Carolina. So we've got a lot to do. I think the first half of 2025 calendar year is going to be really busy for us as we push the remainder of those American Rescue Plan funds out in the beginning of Governor-elect Josh Stein's administration. And then we'll turn our attention to the bipartisan infrastructure law funding that is coming to North Carolina. Most significantly, the $1.5 billion that is associated with the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment program. So between the American Rescue Plan funds and the BEAD program, we actually, within the next few years, will have every single home and business in North Carolina connected to high-speed internet infrastructure, which is just truly astounding. When Amy and Jeff were at the department, they had a lot of good ideas that hinged on actually having money, right? If we only had a few $1,000,000, we could really start addressing this problem. And now we've got $2.5 billion. I should also mention that Annette and Maggie went out and secured an additional $22 million through the State Digital Equity Act capacity program that was just announced recently. And that funding will help us continue to support devices and digital skills and training programs across North Carolina. Next slide, please. And I'm picking up the pace, I promise. One thing I just want to quickly note before speaking a little bit to our work on Hurricane Helene support is it's really important to us as we invest your taxpayer dollars that you and the rest of North Carolina are able to hold us accountable, right? You need to be able to see where the money's going, what our progress is, and hold us to our commitments in terms of building digital equity across North Carolina. So I want to highlight ncbroadband.gov, where we've got county by county and program by program dashboards. I'll note that these numbers are a little bit dated here. We're in the process of updating this dashboard now. It should be closer to 600 million awarded and about 180,000 unserved homes and businesses that have or will have high-speed internet service at the end of a construction project that's ongoing now because of these investments across North Carolina. So I just want to highlight that. I think someone put it in the chat. I encourage you to go play around with it, and you can see our different infrastructure grant programs, our digital equity grant programs that have been funded there. Next slide, please. And then, there's so much need, particularly in Western North Carolina, in the wake of Hurricane Helene. And so we've been spending a lot of time over the last few months trying to figure out how can we use the resources we've got and the programs we've got to help mitigate or recover from those damages. Right now, we are negotiating with internet providers and the General Assembly alike about some flexibility within our infrastructure funding programs so that we can use some of that funding to help internet providers repair or replace damaged or lost infrastructure. But in the meantime, we're trying to create more flexibility for our grantees, for our internet provider partners, and for our digital equity grantees, the nonprofits and community groups across the state that are helping us address the digital divide, giving them more flexibility in terms of reporting schedules and project completion deadlines to make sure that we don't lose good projects or good partners because of the impacts of this storm. We've also solicited a lot of information from internet provider and community partners about damage to either publicly funded or their own existing infrastructure. And I think that's going to be a really central theme in the new long session for the General Assembly is how can we leverage these funds to have more, to drive more creative telecommunication infrastructure solutions. We've also extended timelines associated with our BEAD program, particularly the challenge process, which I'll talk a little bit more about because all of you have an important role there, and our pre-qualification deadline for internet providers, so that we had numerous internet providers that shifted their entire workforce to Western North Carolina in the wake of Helene to try to get networks back online. So we needed to make sure that that they were able to participate in our programs fully, and that the local governments and community organizations in Western North Carolina were able to weigh in on that challenge process. Next slide, please. That challenge process is absolutely critical to making sure we can get the job done across North Carolina with the $2.5 billion, the $1.5 billion from BEAD, plus our ARPA funds. That's the process by which we make sure the map is accurate, that we have an accurate understanding of who is unserved or underserved across North Carolina and which locations are eligible for that infrastructure grant funding. So, unfortunately, the way it's designed at the federal level, individuals can't go online and participate in that challenge process. We need community organizations that are on the ground, that have an understanding of that community, to help funnel that response back and help us at the state level make sure we have an accurate understanding of where the need is and where that funding needs to be driven if we're going to get the job done here. So I just want to highlight this because you have a really important role to play. All the organizations and stakeholders represented here on this call can help us make sure that that our maps are accurate, that our programs are designed right. You know, the problem of the digital divide is not going to be solved in Washington, D.C. It's also not going to be solved in Raleigh, right? It really needs local expertise and ties into affected communities to make sure that that funding works for the people of North Carolina. I think that's my last slide. Do I have another one here? Is there something after this? Yeah. This is the part where I just say, if you have tough questions, we'd love to hear them. Particularly Maggie and Annette would love to hear them because I have to drop. But make them really tough. Really give it to them, okay? But again, thanks all of you for your time, for your partnership, all the work that's been going. You know, I kind of breezed through the Helene slide, but I should mention, because Sara Nichols is here, she's been doing incredible work helping respond, helping local internet providers, particularly the ones that aren't large publicly traded companies, right? Particularly the ones that we really rely on locally to get the job done because they're actually attuned to community need and their local customers. She's been doing incredible work helping folks recover, helping folks find laptops, and keeping things moving where I think government funding hasn't been able to move as quickly and as effectively as we would have liked. So I just want to thank her as well, and then thank again all of you for your time, and look forward to hearing from Annette and Maggie about the rest of the discussion. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you so much, Nate. Appreciate all that information. We put some links in the chat. I really do encourage you all to check out, well, everything Nate said, but specifically that that broadband and digital equity grant tracker is really helpful to see. When we get a lot of questions from constituents asking, you know, when is when is it coming? When is the broadband build out coming? And it gives you those dates, which I think is very helpful. So yeah, if we could move on to the next slide, I'm excited to introduce our incredible panel. I'm gonna just give their quick bios, in order, alphabetical order, and then we're going to paste their longer bios in the chat, and then we're just going to dive in. So first, we're so excited to have Dr. Reverend Dawn Baldwin Gibson, who serves as the pastor of Peletah Ministries, the president of Peletah Institute for Building Resilient Communities, and the senior administrator at Peletah Academic Center for Excellence. And we're also so thrilled to have Amy Huffman here, who is the policy director at the National Digital Inclusion Alliance, and of course is from North Carolina. And we look forward, hopefully Burt Lum can join us. I think we're having some time zone stuff because Burt is the strategy officer for the Hawaii Broadband Initiative at the State Department of Business, Economic Development, and Tourism. And then, of course, our amazing folks from the West, we have Tatiana Magee, who's the regional planner and GIS analyst for the High Country Council of Governments, and Sara Nichols, the energy and economic program development manager at the Land of Sky Regional Council. So I am going to start us off. I think let's just stop sharing that we can like look at each other. So we're just going to start off. We're going to start big and kind of narrow in. So I'm going to start with you, Amy. Amy, you're a Western North Carolina native and have worked in digital equity at the state level in North Carolina, and now you are working nationally. So you have a very unique perspective on this topic, and we're grateful you're here. So, in your perspective or your experience, how has digital equity become more included in disaster recovery conversations and strategies at different levels, community, state, and national? And how has this changed your policy work at NDIA?
Thank you, Jess. Hi, y'all. It's really good to see you, each and every one of you, and see so many familiar faces and names. And thank you, Nate, for the kind introduction. And shout out to Jeff. Good to see you. First of all, I want to say for anyone who was impacted by Hurricane Helene, in any way, shape, or form, that my heart and my prayers have been with you. And thank you for all the great work that you've done to support your neighbors during this time. And thank you for having me here to talk about this. This is really an honor, and honestly, I'm really here to learn from you all. So we'll see if I have anything to share that's actually worthwhile. But what I will say, Jess, is that uh, so I'll start at the end and then back up and go from the beginning. The end is that this conversation is the first conversation that's happening in this way about, I'll call it digital inclusion resilience, that we've seen. So to get to your question, we're not really seeing it being wrapped into disaster response yet. So we have a lot of work to do to make sure that that happens, right? And I'm specifically calling it digital inclusion resilience. There's obviously network resilience and like what the providers do to get networks back up and running. That's a separate conversation that I'm not as well versed in that other people should have. But the digital inclusion side, the work, the like making sure people have computers and devices and can have that critical communication in times of need, and a digital navigator to help fill out FEMA applications. That's what I'm talking about when I talk about digital inclusion resilience. So I'm extremely glad that we're having this conversation. I think it's extraordinarily important because these disasters are not unique. I mean, obviously what happened in Western North Carolina was unique, and they will continue to happen. And some things like what happened in Hawaii that if Burt hopefully is able to join us, we'll tell you about was catastrophic in its own way. And then obviously there's fires that happen out in California in the western part of the country every year, and hurricanes in the eastern North Carolina that happen every year, and tornadoes in the central part of the country. And all of these natural disasters, because they are fueled by man-made climate change, are increasing in regularity and frequency and their levels of destruction. And so it's really incumbent upon all of us that do this work to make sure that we are having these conversations and that we are doing this work and we are beginning to thread the needle of pointing out the connections between how important robust digital inclusion ecosystems are to disaster response. So sort of, I'll say serendipitously, shortly after Helene, FEMA was accepting public comment on their national disaster response framework. And when we learned of this, we thought, okay, this is a great opportunity for us to point out how digital inclusion should be part of a natural disaster response. When we looked at the framework, and I did looked backwards and forwards through it for any reference to broadband, digital inclusion, internet, devices, the only reference to it, to any of those things, was one word, telecommunications. It appeared once, and it appeared in the section about FEMA outlining the different non-governmental partners, and they were talking about how telecommunications providers can be partners in the recovery phase. So we thought, well, okay, there's nothing in here, so we have lots of ideas to share. So basically and I will, after I stop talking for hours. I promise I actually talked for an hour. They gave me 8 minutes. After I stop talking, I'll drop these links in the chat. But the framework has this, they say there's 3 components to this life cycle of a disaster, right? There's the steady state, which is like no disasters happen, but you want to be prepared, and that's just like normal everyday life. Then as a disaster happens, and there's the immediate response, and then there's the recovery and rebuilding. And what we pointed out is that digital inclusion is actually, it shouldn't just be in the recovery and rebuilding phase. It should be part of the response phase and the steady state phase. Like, it should be part of all of these things. And that FEMA and other agencies should be making sure to invest in this work as well. So we said that basically FEMA should consider digital inclusion specifically in 5 key ways. 1, emergency internet access, right? Mobile hotspots, the satellite internet and free public Wi-Fi that Sara and Tatiana have been instrumental in setting up in the western part of the state. Device distribution, so looking to what Pat Millen and E2D are doing from Charlotte, bringing those devices to Western North Carolina. Digital skills and support, so things that the Center for Digital Equity in Charlotte has been supporting and leading in the western part of the state, so making sure digital navigators are there, and multilingual assistance, and digital skills training to help support people getting access to, FEMA benefits or what have you, right? And then online, we say that also there should be online access to resources and services, and that those services should be provided in plain language, easily accessible in multiple languages, easy to access, right? And then there should be equitable funding and policies. So there should be emergency subsidies for broadband for households that can't either afford it or, just to get back to normal life, right, after a disaster. And also that data should be protected and private in that. And so those are, and I'll link to the blog post we have, take a look at it. We developed it learning from what you all were going through and what we were seeing you all do in response to the disaster. We at NDIA, and I don't know if I actually even said who we are, we're a national nonprofit. We represent 1,900 affiliates across the country. We always learn from our community, and then we share those practices that we learned with policymakers. And so that's what we're doing here, is we're going to learn from you all and also share those best practices with other affiliates across the country. We're thinking in the future venues like our annual conference, this will be a big topic of conversation there. So with that, I just want to say again, the other thing that I want to leave you with is that going back to your question, Jess, what are we seeing? What I will say about North Carolina that's so unique is the amazing, robust, healthy, thriving digital inclusion ecosystem across the state. I mean, it was incredibly something to get calls from Pat and Bruce, who are dropping everything else to go west and support neighbors. And not that other states don't have amazing community members who are supporting each other in different ways, but we're not seeing that type of response from the digital inclusion community in other places, right? Because digital inclusion communities and ecosystems aren't as well defined and robust and thriving as it is here in North Carolina, which is something to be proud of, that you all should be incredibly proud of, because that's the work you all have done to get here. We at NDIA, our goal is that those ecosystems exist across the country so that we are all well prepared for natural disasters, because we think really that is what digital inclusion resilience looks like. It's the ecosystem, and that ecosystem's thriving and connecting and talking to each other, and that they're friends and willing to drop everything to go help their neighbors and friends. So with that, I will pass it back to you, Jess, and I look forward to any questions that you all have.
Thank you so much, Amy. I'm glad that we're talking about this, and I'm glad that NDIA is talking about this, and that will be a focus of net inclusion. And I think, part of this webinar is we're sort of testing the waters a little bit to see, like, how many more conversations about this do we need to have? Like, what do we need to do? And so clearly we need to keep having these conversations. And so thank you for being on. And if any panelists have any response to what Amy said, or any additional things thinking about like national policy perspective, please chime in. And if folks on the call have questions, go ahead and throw those in the chat, and we'll be collecting them for the end as well. And I am going to just breeze over Burt for a second, and coming to you, Dr. Dawn. So every year, Dr. Dawn, you lead the efforts to recover from storms in Eastern North Carolina and prepare for future ones. And in the immediate aftermath of Helene, people out west were contacting you via the Eastern North Carolina Disaster Resources Facebook group, which you moderate. And so not only were you responding to the disaster in the West, we were also continuing to monitor, for other storms as we were still in hurricane season. So what is on your mind when you think of preparing regionally and as a state when it comes to connection and digital inclusion?
Well, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to be a part of this panel and to learn. Thank you, Amy, for your comments. They're so important. And I just want to say, before I talk about Hurricane Helene, I want to thank Director Taylor. I want to thank her office, Maggie Woods, all of them, because they position us to be in a better position because of their amazing work. And so we have been monitoring, kind of watching this year, because we had something called this no-name storm, right? And it wiped out a lot of telecommunications, and people were literally not able to connect to find out where evacuations were happening. They couldn't access their telehealth or teletherapy resources. And so what we recognized was that this issue around connectivity was an issue that we needed to address in what we call blue sky planning. And so for us, blue sky planning is what we do before the storm hits. It is when we tell folks, get to know your emergency management director. It's hard building relationships in disasters. Do it before. And so how to get food in, how to get water in. But what we realized this year, like we had not seen before, is that this ability to be connected is really a matter of life and death. And so we initially, with the no-name storm back in August, I think it might have been, we started planning this resiliency collaborative. So we've been doing these resiliency collaboratives for the last few years. There's a reason why we have had Director Taylor speak every year at one of them, because we understand that this ability to connect, to get resource information is what helps our folks stay safe, healthy, and well in, during, and after a disaster. And so from that position, it was interesting. My heart is with those that have been impacted by Hurricane Helene. We are still doing outreach work as we try to support. And part of that support showed up through the Eastern North Carolina Disaster Resource page. It's for Eastern North Carolina, but people reached out from the western part of the state to find out what resources we had. Like, what are you all doing? Can you help us? Now, we hosted a kickoff resiliency collaborative in September of this year. It literally was 3 days, and it was the first time we had it as a hybrid. Now, why do we have it hybrid and not virtual? Because we had so many people that did not have an email address. And so basic things that we think are common, what we recognize in our communities is not common. And so we did this hybrid. Director Taylor spoke. We had people from Buncombe County and throughout the western part of the state that were able to be a part of that collaborative, that resiliency collaborative. And so when people started reaching out, we reached out to our FEMA partners at the White House. And what we said was, you remember we talked to y'all about a month ago about this no-name storm? We still have this issue. And literally every week, we were talking with the Center of Faith and Community Partnerships in FEMA, having weekly conversations about what people from the western part of the state state were saying to us about what was happening, what they needed, and the resources that were needed. And because of that, we were able to allow there to be this additional federal response that we had no idea that we would be a part of. And so when we're doing blue sky planning, what Amy was just talking about, we really need to have this conversation about this equity, about digital inclusion, because people need devices. We just got an order in from Camden this week, and every device has already been accounted. People, when they saw what happened in the western part of the state, said, I need a device. I'm not connected. I don't know what's going to happen. And people became a bit anxious. And so we've been working through that and working with how do we deal with the issues that we talked about: access, affordability, devices, and building those skills. And that's what this work is so important for us to continue to look at. And so while we're thinking about the importance of telecommunications, what we're also learning in these rural conversations that we're having through our needs assessments process is that it's an issue around health and wellness. And so people can't get to their doctor, but they can access telehealth if they have the access, if they have the affordability, if they have the device, and if they have the skills. FEMA, how do many people have to do their forms? Online. Well, if you don't have those 4 items, you don't have access. If you have a branch that falls on your house, many insurance agents now don't come to the house. They say, upload your pictures. And well, if we have people that don't have these resources, then we have people that are not going to be able to, what we call, be resilient, to bounce back. We call it bounce forward. And so all of these issues around health and wellness, around emergency response, all of these things are now things that we're thinking about as we're thinking about disaster preparedness. And this is work that we've been doing through the Peletah Institute for Building Resilient Communities for more than a decade. But what we recognize is that this is an issue that cannot be refused. People need the information, they need the infrastructure, and they need the ability to connect. And what's happening here in North Carolina is really groundbreaking because of the work that's happening at the North Carolina Office of Digital Equity and Literacy and at Band NC. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Dawn. Every time you're on a webinar for us, I get chills. And I really, really appreciate what you said about how, the impacts of Helene, obviously they were felt throughout the state, physically, emotionally, but also that it was sobering for folks who realized, like, oh my gosh, what would I do if I lost connection, if I lost power, and that has also driven up the need in the eastern part of the state as well. I mean, I think that's a really important a point to make. So I'm gonna take us now to the west, but then we're going to be able to have, if again, a panelist, if you want to jump in to sort of comment back to another panelist, that's great. But I'm going to go ahead and ask Sara and Tatiana, thank you so much for joining us when you both are still very much in recovery efforts and working to meet your community's immediate needs. So first, just going to ask, what does broadband and digital inclusion recovery look like for your regions right now? And then, maybe in the next 6 months or so, because I feel like it is changing very rapidly.
Sara, I'll let you go first. I don't know who's supposed to go first.
Thanks for the question. So the providers are, to me, heroes, just like the line workers and the first responders. The connection between communications and people who were missing was so intricate that the more connectivity we could turn on in those first days, the more we could kind of skip over places in the region that were fine, they just couldn't report themselves as such, and narrow in the scope to people that really still needed, specialized equipment or specialized help. So what that meant, though, is that a lot of stuff was done in a haste make waste situation. So it went on fast. It didn't go on well. Just like our power went on fast, it didn't go on well. And every time the wind blows, we end up with these isolated power outages that also include outages for our communications network. If I think about how that intersects with what's coming next, it jeopardizes the effectiveness of the BEAD program and how we were, as a region, positioned in a state. We were positioned really well to get last mile up and running. But now questions like what's an address are top of mind, or are the providers going to be resourced in a way that they can get their network safe and secure back up online in time to meet all of the other stuff that's coming next, and should they? So this idea about diverse technology, we've been heavily fiber focused, but I have a lot of wrestling mind with redundancy versus resiliency, and what kind of technologies did what kind of thing, what's out there that we should be looking at. So we're interested in some planning work on broadband and digital equity resiliency plan, probably in the coming months, so that we can have those conversations with our communities. Some of them are very hot to rebuild with buried utilities in the mountains. That's a very expensive way to do it. And other risk is if things were on the pole, we could light up the cable or the fiber as quickly as the power went back on. For areas across the region that had buried utilities, it took a lot longer to get something working. We, just like we were not ready for the physical impacts of a storm, we are not ready for what's next, because we are a region of some general community and economic status. We went from being the lowest unemployment rate in the state to the highest. And for every blog post and media thing that you see that is a beautiful picture of people coming together, and that absolutely has happened, there are just as many looting, rioting, thieving happening in the background, indicating people are stressed out, they're resource poor. And as long as that goes on, the whole nature of how we're in our community infrastructure kind of takes a different kind of turn. And Tatiana, I'll let you have a minute.
Yeah, I just want to say everything Sara just said and Dr. Dawn said resonates so much with everything. We're both in Western North Carolina. We're like top left-hand corner. Again, I guess I'll introduce, I'm with the High Country Council of Governments. We cover 7 counties, top left-hand corner of North Carolina. Our southernmost counties, Avery, Mitchell, Yancey, usually referred to as the Amy region, were definitely the hardest hit, but every single county has been impacted. I was in Allegheny this morning. Our northernmost county bordering Virginia, they still have their own impacts. And what I really wanted to speak to was, from what Sara and Dr. Dawn were saying, is that in the immediate aftermath, connectivity was top of mind in the sense of like communicating, but it was just like in any way possible. Like people weren't like, I lost this and I need this back, but people are like, these are my basic needs. Like, I don't have shelter. It snowed within like 2 weeks after the storm here in Boone. And so like one day it was like, we need hotspots, and it's like, it's about to be 20 degrees. We need sleeping bags, we need heaters, we need propane. And something that I just took to heart, and I feel like everyone in the High Country Council of Governments, Fred Wilson is a recently hired digital navigator within our aging department, he's on this call, was to not just stop at connectivity too, but similar to how FEMA and Amy with NDIA are trying to incorporate digital inclusion into FEMA, as people working in digital inclusion, making sure that it's like, no, I stop at tablets, I stop at hotspots, I stop at internet connectivity, but what other resources do we have? Like, I can drop off these hotspots and SIM cards, and I can get you like 0-degree sleeping bags, has been a really big thing to continue on those conversations and not necessarily stay relevant, but also just for people to understand that you are there. I don't want to speak to the whole state or what's going on in Land of Sky either, but misinformation and disinformation has been playing a huge factor, especially in our hardest hit areas, that there can be a lot of distrust going on, whether it comes to FEMA or any sort of assistance in general. There could be different connotations of like, oh, you need a device, here's this one. You could slap on like a government logo on it, and then like certain people would be very apprehensive to receiving that because they're like, whoa, what do I need to fill out? What personal information do you need? Like, I haven't even filled out FEMA. Does that cancel this out? And so similar to what Dr. Dawn was saying, is having those pre-existing connections within each small community has been super critical. Because we didn't have pre-existing connections with our emergency operations center directors, that was something that we just started doing as a result of Helene. That's not something that we're like, oh, this is the contact point for this county, this is where they're situated, this is what they're doing. So maintaining contact at the county level, but they have also just been completely focused on water infrastructure, sewer infrastructure, temporary housing, keeping people warm during the snow. That even when I spoke to them and I was like, you have these resources available, it's really hard for a team, a relatively small team, once the national presence went away at the emergency operations centers, to know these are the really small community crossroad areas that don't have internet or don't have cell signal. But I guess like sort of touching base with both of them has been really important, and connecting them as well. Speaking to something that Dr. Dawn said earlier about telehealth appointments, especially in this area of Western North Carolina where we don't have a lot of specialists. Even though Allegheny wasn't as severely hit, they have had a lot of impacts for their patients. Specifically, they have an older population who can't get to their specialists and need telehealth. And then there's also the component of, is there like a soundproof private area to even do those telehealth appointments if they don't have a home to go back to? Or sometimes there is a home, but there's a lot of homes here that have private bridges that washed out, and that's one of the biggest disconnecting factors in those lesser hit areas, is that those private bridges, there's no way to get to the home or no way to leave the home. Something that we did also learn, and Sara can speak to this more, was Cramden, ETD Cramden. I think y'all are on here. We appreciate you so much with everything you've done in the past, you're currently doing, and that we will keep doing in the future. But ETD and Cramden both donated devices. Cramden donated smartphones, and those were gone, similar to what Dr. Dawn was saying with the laptops, almost immediately. There is a massive need for smartphones, especially with the FEMA applications. They're like, take photos, and people are like, I don't have anything to take photos with in the first place, is a really big issue. Or they might not know how to because they've never taken photos for fun. So those smartphones are big. We've been distributing them with a lot of our stakeholders from our digital inclusion planning process, which have then like trickled down into having new stakeholders, which pre-Helene, similar again to what Dr. Dawn was saying, they're like, oh, this is super relevant now, and like trying to hop on board as quickly as possible in the wake of Helene. And in a lot of the cases of the smartphones, those people didn't have a smartphone to begin with. That is very, very common. So working on like the supply side, which I know Pat is probably thinking internally, is there's this huge demand and you need the supply. So trying to work with those sort of smaller internet service providers, smaller cell service providers to get those trade-in phones to then potentially be refurbished. Local businesses, again, that sort of donation pipeline. But yeah, I just really wanted to emphasize on having those key sites and key contact points in the different community crossroads have been massive, because someone in Burnsville who's only in Burnsville might not know what's going on. in the rest of Yancey County. Someone in Boone who never leaves Boone will not know what's going on in Zionville area. So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Tatiana. Oh,
Jess, can I pick up the 6-month time frame of the question here, pertinent specifically to digital inclusion? Devices is huge. A lot of people lost their device to the storm physically, or they lost the job that had the device. So I'm glad Tatiana mentioned that. Cramden E2D, we add our own refurbishment program. We also partner with Through the Trees here. And we have scaled that, the work we thought we'd do all year, we've done in the last 3 weeks. Getting those through the system and back into the community through, we did this technology recovery program, which is a lot for our team to manage. But also, I don't want to say that digital literacy is not important, but I reprioritized what this disaster response to digital equity mean, and put devices at a higher capacity, because a lot of people had the literacy, but now just need this one thing, and can I get that in their hands, and how quickly can I do it? Second to that is, now we're going to have systemic poverty. We already do. And Amy, I loved what you said about, is there a way there could be an emergency broadband subsidy that would help so many people? The Starlink units came with free service to the end of the year. If you could get it, those were expensive. Those were hard to find. But we're looking at ways to build our public Wi-Fi programs, particularly in places with some density. And ideally not with programming that takes us a long time to upfit. So if we can just find the tech and get the sites, how fast can we do this?
Mm-hmm.
And Jess, sorry for interrupting you. Go on.
No. That was exactly right. We're getting towards the end of time, but we have some questions, and I do want to ask our panelists one final question. I'm going to start with Sara and Tatiana, because I think this gets at a couple of questions in the chat as well. And then if folks are okay, we might go over time a little bit to get to some specific questions. But this is being recorded and we will send that out. So first, what can we do in the call, but also, what should groups like the state, Band and C, local and regional governments, what should we be putting into action when it comes to digital inclusion disaster plans?
I just wanted to speak. I saw Susan's comment about community centers, and that's like right on the money. And I remember Sara early on in a meeting that we were in, I can't even remember anymore, shortly after the storm, spoke about the COGS sort of being a liaison between the community and those emergency operations centers in the county. And I feel like answering and acknowledging Susan's question that's kind of where I could see us playing a role in that. And then first of all, it's to be aware, like we do cover 7 counties. Now Fred is on the team and he has connected with people that I haven't been able to connect with yet. But it is, most of the time, it's a pretty small team. It was just me, so I couldn't get to every nook and cranny. But if there's someone that you know or anything, like even just reaching out in a quick email or like sharing numbers, which text has been honestly the main form of communication, I feel like for everyone after the storm at this point, because email wouldn't load, is having those sites in mind and having that contact point ahead of time instead of having to do all that work immediately after something so traumatic happening. And similar to what Sara was saying too, is having those supplies on hand. We got some Starlinks donated, which it feels like everybody did. And then some small portable cell towers donated as well, which have been really critical in some of the smaller communities in Mitchell and Yancey. And I just dropped a big one off at Beuladine Community Center yesterday in Mitchell. And that was a connection that was pretty recent. Beuladine Community Center hadn't necessarily been on our radar pre-Helene, but now we do have that pre-existing relationship. I also just want to acknowledge just the fact that as a Colombian American too, and as a Spanish speaking individual, a lot of the people in that population and every sort of specific demographic has had the large behavior pattern of like going to places that they trust. So a lot of those people haven't been going to the main county or town distribution site, whether it's because they've had a negative experience or they've heard of a negative experience, because for every wonderful thing that you see, and I've seen the best in people, but I've also seen the worst in people after this. And so they might avoid help at a place that has the most resources to go to a place that has a smaller set of resources, doesn't have as much, can't do as much, just because they feel safe there. And I think taking those small nonprofits that serve specific covered and priority populations was NCDIT has done a great job at sort of incorporating that in all of the grant applications and projects. But as a cog and as potential grantees to really hone in on that, especially when it comes to disaster recovery and resilience, because most of the time those people were already and underserved, and that gap has just increased even further. And that's it.
Thanks, Tatiana. Does any other panelists want to jump in on that question before we move to a quick Q&A? And I just want to say clearly this, as Amy said, this is maybe one of the first meetings that she was invited to on this topic. And so we will, clearly this is a topic that needs more discussion, right? And we know we're going to be working on this at so many different levels, community, regional, state. And we at Band and Sea are here to like continue to convene folks and connect folks across the state. And we're sorry Burt couldn't join us from Hawaii. He was having technical issues, but that just gives us another opportunity to invite him to a future meeting, and maybe even have him on a podcast. I'm just like, it's recorded, Burt, come to our podcast. But yeah, does anyone else want to add to what Tatiana said? Okay, I think that's a good place to end with I think we can have a whole webinar just on that last question. So pin that for our next webinar. But I do want to just, looks like there's some connections made in the chat. And Dr. Don is asking, Sara and Tatiana, how can we support your work and how can we support you all? And it sounds like, you might be if there's any other things you want to say, but it seems like you might be making some on email connections. And we had a couple questions in the chat. So there's a question around changing federal administration and how that might impact digital equity and broadband funds flowing to North Carolina. Maybe that's a question for you, Amy. Dare you answer?
Yeah, so this could also be a whole webinar, but I'll keep it short. I don't know if the legislation who the questioner was referring to is the BEAD legislation or the Digital Equity Act legislation. I think, yes, there is some chance that the new Congress and the new NTIA may shift priorities. Well, they will be shifting priorities, but may shift priorities in these programs that we care so deeply about. So we're keeping an eye on that. If you're on our listserv, there, at least Senator Ted Cruz has already pointed out one area of the Digital Equity Act that he's disagrees with. And but we'll see what happens. In the short term, I think everything is staying the same, but then come the new administration, I would stay tuned and stay ready to remind people why these programs matter and why this work matters.
Thank you, Amy. And there's a question also about digital navigation. So we discussed programs like digital navigation and digital navigators and said the info is multilingual. Our navigators trained to make sure the info is accessible to people with disabilities as well, in plain language, screen readers, etc. I can start to answer that question, and then if anyone else wants to jump in. So digital navigators are an amazing resource, and they operate on so many different levels in North Carolina, right? So we have digital navigators out of our community colleges. We have digital navigators that work for United Way and 211. We have digital navigators who are at the library. And so it sort of really depends on the program. And then, of course, we have our digital skill educators with extension. So we have so many different digital navigators across the state, which is amazing. And so some of them are multilingual. Folks with disabilities, that's something I'm really passionate about, making things more accessible. And I do know that there are, I think it sort of depends on the program, but we're also lucky to have a really amazing North Carolina Assistive Technology program. And and this is all part of our state digital equity plan. So if anyone else wants to speak on that, Maggie, I don't know if you wanted to speak on that. Yep, Maggie's raising her hand. Pass it to Maggie.
Yeah, so I think my response was similar to yours, Jess, is it sort of depends on the program itself. What I'll say is in listening sessions throughout the state, when we were developing the digital equity plan, there was a real concern from people who work with the disability community that there need to be very specific programs focused on very specific disabilities, like digital navigator programs, because more harm could be done instead of good. So as a whole, we haven't seen a lot in the state. In fact, I can only name one program, a digital navigator program that's very focused on one specific disability. It's Lions Services. They're just launching something called Lions Den. I'm putting it in the chat. It's for services for the blind, digital navigation services for the blind. This is something that's going to be a focus in some of our next funding rounds. And so if this is something that you that you're interested in, that you have expertise in, we'd love to have some conversations because we need more of these digital navigation services focused in this way.
Thank you, Maggie. And great plug for the capacity grants coming out, which will be sometime next year. So I know we've already gone over, but I just want to again thank everyone so much for joining us. And clearly this is going to be the first of many conversations. I'll also do a quick plug for our convening next year, which is going to be in partnership with the Office of Digital Equity and Literacy. So Maggie and Annette's office on April 28th at Hunt Library in Raleigh. We started off by doing these state digital equity convenings. We started off in the West in June, and now we're coming central, and then we're going east. So please join us. That will be a free event, and we'll save the date, but we'll be sending out registration information in the new year. So in the meantime, everyone have a happy and safe holidays. And like I said, we will be sending out the recording, all of the many links that were shared, and the slides as well. So thank you so much, everyone.